The worst pandemic in recorded human history ended in 1353. Within a single generation, in the same cities, on the same streets, still marked by the dead, something new began that would permanently reshape every human culture that followed. That's not supposed to happen. You don't survive the death of half your civilization and immediately produce the Renaissance. That's not how grief works. That's not how collapse works. And yet, in October 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors were dead or dying, their bodies covered in black, swollen lumps, oozing. The harbor authorities ordered the ships out immediately. It was already too late. Within weeks, the sickness was moving inland. Within months, it was everywhere. By the time the first wave was over, roughly 5 years later, somewhere between a third and more than half of Europe's entire population was dead. The numbers are so large they stop feeling like numbers. Nobody alive had seen anything like it. Nobody's descendants would either. Florence, 1348. Before the plague arrived, the city held somewhere around 80,000 to 100,000 people, a major medieval metropolis. Within the first year and a half, contemporary accounts and modern historians estimate that more than half of them were gone. Some estimates put the death toll at 60,000 or more. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Entire family lines ended in weeks. Giovanni Boccaccio was there. He survived. He wrote about it. Bodies in the streets. People dying alone, dogs dragging corpses through alleys because there was nobody left to bury them. A city that had stopped functioning as a city and started functioning as a mass grave with surviving inhabitants. And then, within a few years of that, he sat down and wrote what would become one of the founding texts of European literature. 100 stories. Humor, human desire, flawed, ordinary people treated as though their lives deserved to be understood. The Decameron. There's a question buried in that fact that nobody asks clearly enough. Why? What happens inside a civilization after watching half of itself die that could possibly produce something like the Renaissance? That question has a real answer, and the answer is stranger than you've been told. Start with what the Black Death actually broke, not just bodies, systems. Before the plague arrived, Europe had a specific problem. Too many people, not enough land. Peasants were desperate. Landlords had near absolute power. The system was called feudalism, and if you were a serf inside it, which most people were, you existed somewhere between a tenant and property. You worked the land your lord assigned you, you gave him a portion of everything you grew, you couldn't leave without his permission, you couldn't negotiate, you had nowhere else to go and no leverage to demand anything. Then the plague killed your neighbor, and the one after him, and half the village, and suddenly your lord needed you, not the other way around. This is the moment historians mark as the pivot point in European feudalism. Not a revolt, not a war, a disease. Labor became the scarcest thing on the continent overnight, and the people who survived it had something they had never possessed before: choice. The English crown tried to stop it immediately. In 1351, Parliament passed what they called the Statute of Laborers, a law designed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and legally compel workers to accept employment from any lord who asked for it. It failed, catastrophically. There weren't enough courts, there weren't enough enforcers, there weren't enough people left to make the old rules stick. Surviving workers walked away from their traditional lords and went wherever the pay was better. The law said, stay where you are, accept what you've always been given. The workers said, no. And for the first time in centuries, the workers won. That's not just an economic shift. That's the first crack in the idea that every person has a fixed place in the world, and that place is permanent, and it always will be. But that's not even the most important thing that cracked. The church didn't just fail during the Black Death. It failed in front of everyone, at once, with nowhere to hide. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the most powerful institution in European life. It explained the world. It mediated between humans and God. It offered meaning inside suffering, and suffering was everywhere in medieval life, so this was not a small thing. Popes commanded armies. Kings answered to them. When the plague arrived, it went directly into the churches. It killed the priests. It killed the monks in their monasteries, communities of prayer that were particularly vulnerable because they lived in close quarters and cared for the sick as a matter of religious duty. It killed in ways that the church's theology had absolutely no framework to explain. Was it divine punishment? For
what sin? Entire villages of devout Christians died horribly while sinners elsewhere survived. The pattern made no sense, and everyone could see it. Some clergy abandoned their posts rather than stay near the dying. Others sold fake relics, fragments of bone claimed to be from saints, and promised protection they couldn't deliver. The flagellant movement spread across Europe. Groups of ordinary people walking from town to town, flogging themselves publicly until they bled, convinced that extreme suffering might appease a god who seemed to have reached his limit. Pope Clement VI, isolated in Avignon, kept alive partly by following his physician's advice to sit between large burning fires and refuse all contact with visitors, issued a formal declaration in 1349 condemning the flagellants and ordering them to stop. They ignored him. A pope ignored by ordinary people in public at scale. That had not happened before. Not like that. The church survived it. It remained powerful for another century, but something had shifted in the relationship between ordinary Europeans and the institutions that claimed the exclusive right to explain the universe. A crack, small enough to overlook, large enough that something different could eventually grow inside it. When that many people die, someone inherits what they leave behind: property, land, merchant accounts. In some cases, the combined assets of 3 or 4 relatives who all died within weeks of each other. The historian David Herlihy, who spent decades studying the demographic and economic aftermath of the Black Death, documented what happened in Italian cities in the generation after the outbreak. Surviving heirs frequently inherited from multiple family lines simultaneously. Wealth that had been distributed across large, extended families rapidly concentrated into far fewer hands. In Florence, this created something the previous social order hadn't quite produced before: a class of people with more accumulated wealth than the old system had been built to absorb, and with no obvious traditional way to spend it. They had money, they had time, and they had grown up in a world where everything that was supposed to be permanent had proven, visibly, in living memory, to not be. So they funded things with no immediate practical use: art, architecture, the recovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been sitting in monastery libraries for centuries, untouched. The Medici family is the name most people recognize, but they were one example of a much broader pattern: survivors with inherited resources, living in a world that no longer felt fixed, spending money on the question of what human life actually meant now that the old answers had failed. That question needed to go somewhere. Francesco Petrarch lost the woman he had spent years writing about to the plague in 1348. Laura died in Avignon. He kept writing after, not primarily about God, not about divine hierarchy or moral instruction, about the experience of being a specific person with specific grief, questions that the theology he had been raised inside couldn't reach. Historians call this humanism, not the word as it's used today with all its modern weight, but the original idea that individual human experience, individual loss, individual thought was a subject serious enough to demand serious attention. That idea wasn't invented in 1348, but before the plague, it lived at the margins of European intellectual life. After, it moved toward the center, and you can trace a direct line from that shift to everything that defines the Renaissance: the portraits that look like actual specific people instead of symbols of virtue, the architecture built at human scale rather than purely at the scale of the divine, the literature that treats ordinary experience as something that deserves to be understood, not just used as a vehicle for theological instruction. None of that appears from nowhere. It appears when the old answers fail publicly enough and completely enough that people have no choice but to start building new ones. Here's where you need to stop and hold that for a second, because that's not the whole picture. The real shape of what happened is stranger than any of those pieces suggest on their own.
Here's what gets missed in every version of this story. The Renaissance didn't happen after the Black Death, in spite of the destruction. It happened because of what the destruction did to 3 specific things simultaneously. Feudalism, the system that assigned every person a fixed position with no exit, cracked under labor scarcity. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had leverage. The church's monopoly on meaning, its exclusive, unchallenged authority to explain suffering and death and the shape of the universe, cracked when its explanations failed in front of the people who needed the most at the moment they needed the most. And the assumption that the world was permanent, that the structure you were born into would outlast you, that tomorrow would look like yesterday, that the old order was simply how things were, cracked when more than half the people around you died in 18 months. These 3 things didn't crack one at a time. They cracked together, all at once, in the same cities. And that simultaneity is everything.
Because when one pillar collapses, people lean harder on the others. When all three collapse at once, there's nothing left to lean on. That is an extraordinarily dangerous position. It is also, historically, the only position from which certain questions stop being optional. Think about Boccaccio again. Sitting in a half-empty Florence, writing 100 stories about flawed, funny human people, desire and grief and foolishness, treated as though they mattered, because the plague had just demonstrated, at maximum volume, that the frameworks the world had been built around were not enough. He wasn't writing in triumph. He wasn't celebrating survival. He was building something to fill a void that mass death had created. That void, that sudden, violent absence of certainty about the world and what it meant to be a person inside it is what the Renaissance is actually a response to. Not a natural flowering of human genius, not an inevitable next chapter of progress. A response, built into wreckage by people who had run out of old answers and had no choice but to start making new ones. Petrarch kept writing after 1348, after Laura, after the plague, after the world he had been raised inside proved it could unmake itself in a season. His letters, hundreds of them, read unlike almost anything that came before in European writing. He wrote about what it felt like to grieve, what it felt like to be uncertain about everything you had been taught to trust, what it meant to be a specific human being with a specific life, not a symbol, not a fixed role, not a position in a divine hierarchy, just a person, trying to understand what had happened to them, a man, a loss. The strange, necessary act of taking your own experience seriously enough to write it down. Before the plague, that wouldn't have seemed important enough to bother with. After, it was the question that changed everything. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe, it killed the world that didn't need to ask why, and left behind the one that had to.